for the commercial banking group, including its local and international subsidiaries. Notably, she led the efforts in defining a digital finance strategy for the bank, including the launch of its first ever innovation hub. Honors graduate at the University of Toronto. Her previous work experience includes Merrill Lynch investment banking, Diamond Management and Technology Consultants, as well as Community Lab in New York, where as Director of Process and Execution Strategy, she worked directly with the CEO of this nonprofit organization to define their overall implementation strategies and negotiate partnerships with local development agencies. Please join me in welcoming once again to the platform, Yvonne Johnson. With a warm applause, please.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Workers' Day. I'm grateful to Pastor Poju and Pastor Toyin for having me back at the platform. It's really an honor to speak to this audience. The punchline for my talk today is intellectual curiosity. So if you forget everything that you hear today, if you remember nothing else, I want to make the argument that intellectual curiosity is that way that you innovate in the future. And so if you have your notepads, you can write it down. If you want to remember it in brackets, just put amebo because it's the same sort of thing. Today's topic is about innovating our way into the future. And all of us are joined together by being entrepreneurs, having a knack for enterprise, entrepreneurs as well. And so looking at this topic, the way that I want to structure it is just to deep dive into 3 different areas. One is to take a step back and say, look, what really is our role as entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs? Things are changing so fast, there's a lot of things that are moving, right? And so we really need to take a step back and say, look, what is that role, right? And more importantly, what defines success? The second part of it is really looking at an attempt at predicting the future. And that is the most practical application of intellectual curiosity. You really cannot innovate for the future unless you take a stab at predicting it accurately. And lastly, we look at what is that required innovation. As Nigerian African entrepreneurs, what is that innovation that is required, right? Because we desperately need these successes, and we as entrepreneurs are the ones to create it. And so the first thing we look at is our roles, right? What is our role as entrepreneurs? What is our role as intrapreneurs? I used to be an entrepreneur. And I think it's very innovative to exclude that out in the platform this year, right? Really talking about entrepreneurship. It's very important, right? And we have a lot of definitions, and a lot of people are going to deep dive into that. But very simply, an entrepreneur is an entrepreneur within an organization. You're essentially driving innovation and growth within organizations. Your role is to identify and develop new products, new services, and business models. The difference between an entrepreneur and a regular employee is that you're actively seeking these new opportunities, right? You're actively seeking ways that you create value. And so this role, as well as the role of an entrepreneur, it has a large surface area. There's a lot of ways, things that you have to do, right? There's the idea generation part, right? That's important. What's the vision? What's the idea, right? Building structure. You don't get to any level of scale without that, right? So there's structure, there's process that you have to build. Managing people. That's, an important part of the role as well, right? But both roles require visionary leadership. It's you're given to see something that does not yet exist, and you have this future of the image that you have cultivated, and a lot of your work involves getting others to buy into that vision and really getting them to invest in the efforts towards it. And so how do you structure your life? Knowing that, having that visionary capacity is important in these roles, right? How do you structure your life so that this visionary capacity continues to increase? And that's where intellectual curiosity comes from. That's where the curiosity about your industry, about what the future looks like, and about where the opportunities are going to come from. Intellectual curiosity is about asking the right questions so that you can accurately fill in the gaps. Because like we said, with this role, it has a large surface area. There's a lot that you're thinking about, right? But you have to be curious enough to be able to ask the right questions so that the right insights and the right wisdom bubbles up, right? And so practically, how do you develop this? What is a practical way of doing this? And it's very simple. One of the things is just reading, right? Reading a lot, reading widely. And nowadays, because of technology, reading also means, audiobooks and, YouTube channels and whatnot, right? Like I said, I used to be an entrepreneur, and I spent a lot of my time when I moved to entrepreneurship, reading, right? As an entrepreneur, and again, there's going to be a lot of people talking about that. One of the things I did a lot when I was within corporate, and I always advise people and professionals, is that when you think about the organization that you're in, you cannot be a successful entrepreneur if you have not read the annual report of your company. I promise you it would be the most boring piece of material you would read. But I also promise you you'll be better for it. Because the disclosure requirements in that dense piece of material is high. There's a lot of things that are in there, right? You learn about your company. Are you guys making money or not, right? Who are your suppliers? Who are your vendors, right? Who's the competition? What is happening? So I always tell people that, you have to read that material. Even if you're working within the Nigerian branch of a foreign organization, go to the foreign organization's global website, download it and read it. You have to read this material. Another thing is attending the AGMs, right? Or logging into investor calls, right? The important thing, the reason why that's important is that you start to see some of the pressures that your CEO is under. Remember, you're an entrepreneur, right? Your job, you're trying to create value. And look, we're Nigerians, we're all given into enterprise. A lot of us, yes, I'm working in corporate, but it's not my father's company. I'm just waiting to start my own. But entrepreneurship gives you a comfortable platform to do that, right? And it's probably the best ground to prepare for an entrepreneur. And so you go into these AGMs, you're logging into, the investor calls, you start to see the pressure that your CEO is under, right? Because in these calls, in these forums, the CEO is being pelted with questions from all the stakeholders, whether it's investors, it's shareholders, it's regulators, right? And then the light bulb starts going off in your head about, why things are the way they are within the organization and where the opportunities are. So it's definitely something that I recommend, especially as an entrepreneur, right? But yes, intellectual curiosity, a practical way of doing this is reading, right? And then we also, when we talk about our roles as entrepreneurs, right? And again, it's carrying that vision. We also think about, look, what's going to drive success? There's a lot of change that has happened in the world, recently. There's a lot of complexity that has come up. And determination for me is still that lever for success. The entrepreneurial journey is very tough, right? Success is not always logical. It's usually not always about the best idea or, brilliance, right? And so that determination is important, right? And being within a corporate does not necessarily mean it's easy or whatnot. I mean, you do have the comfort of, the platform or whatnot, but that determination is important, right? Because even within the corporate, where you're trying to drive innovation, you're trying to drive change, you also need to be determined. I mean, I used to, like I said, work within a bank, right? Very regulated industry, right? And I remember some of the times where we tried to drive change, right? And you'll be surprised that just some people within the bank and their job is just to say no. Okay, so we want, no, Yvonne, it's not going to work. No, but no. At some point in time, one guy said, Yvonne, the CBN Act 14.7 says this thing you are doing is illegal. The Senate can call us. And I was like, that was his job. But then, at some point in time, I said, let me just leave it. They will cuckoo pay salary next week. But then, as an entrepreneur, and I'm also running a fintech, I now have to pay attention to that CBN Act 14.7, right? So determination is important, for both roles. There is a high frequency of things going wrong. So you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. You have to embrace failure because it's not the end. And so much of your success is not giving up, is making sure that you're sufficiently determined. And entrepreneurial success, when we think about our roles, we're talking about our roles as entrepreneurs, it's a huge lever towards national success. And Nigeria needs a lot of big wins, right? We have huge development wins, right? And so success in this role for you, right, is big and it's major. So the second thing that we also look at is the future, right? It's uncertain, but we can at least make educated guesses based on trends, right? Because you certainly cannot innovate for a future that you cannot accurately predict. One of the things, like I talked about, your role is, to have that image of the future and really just get people to invest in it, right? So you have to be able to make an attempt at, predicting the future. And it's important to be mostly right about what the future is, right? It's a predictive exercise, right? But you want to be mostly right, right? And like I said, this is the most practical application of intellectual curiosity, because asking the right questions, being curious enough, would make sure that that picture of the future that you're predicting is as accurate as possible. And there's a higher degree of complexity in today's operating environment, right? The speed of change is scary. It's almost unfair, right? And so when you're thinking about the future and you're asking the right questions and you're trying to paint the future, you want to focus on, the trends that are gaining momentum, right? You want to make sure that you're not just talking about maybe things that may be just blips, right? What are some of the trends, that are gaining momentum? And there are three that I, in particular, have been focusing on, right? One is geopolitics. The second one is financial markets. And the third, of course, is technology. You can't get away from that, right? And there's been rising geopolitical tensions, right? The two big elephants are fighting, the US and China. And that has huge implications for all of us. The US is a global superpower, right? China is also number two. But China is a big trading partner to a lot of our nations, right? And they're now explicitly courting other nations to take sides, right? So that's something that, is going to play a role in the future, and we have to be able to pay attention to that, right? Financial markets, some of this might seem complex, it might seem like it might not apply to you, but it does, right? So what's happening is that interest rates are higher to combat higher inflation, right? There was an era of low interest rates, and that enabled huge technology innovation, which we benefited from. Chuka just talked about it, right? Nigerian startups and, startups on the continent, we all benefited from, that wave of, venture capital funding, a lot of that triggered by low interest rates, right? And so now that some of that has pulled back, it has implications for that. So that's now a part of the future that might be permanent. So you have to think about that. Governments also borrowed, during this era. And so their inability to refinance at, lower rates has implications, right? When they're cash strapped, they start to think about new ways of raising money, right? That's when new fees and taxes and levies come in, right? So as you're thinking about the future, as you're predicting it, as you're curious about it, right? These are some of the things that, they're likely to show up, right? And you have to start to think about that, the implications of that. Inflation, it's a monster that no one wants, right? It decreases the purchasing power of money, right? Your costs go up, consumer demand comes down, right? It doesn't get more direct than that when you think about the implications of the future. So again, just thinking about, predicting the future, right? Because remember, my argument is that you have to be curious enough about it so that the picture of the future that you're creating is as accurate as possible, right? So that you can innovate for it, right? And lastly is technology. We can't get away from it. It's an amazing lever. It has demonstrated the power to improve humanity. And it's arguably the biggest lever in driving innovation, right? When you talk about innovating for the future, technology is going to play a role. And your curiosity about technology is a decent framework for predicting the future. There is a 100% chance that an existing technology has impacted your business, whether you see it or you do not see it. And there is a 100% chance that an emerging technology is coming to impact your business, whether you see it or not, right? So you have to be curious about technology. What are some of the trends happening, right? And how do you predict, the implications on your business? Again, three that I think about, often, that I'm curious about. Electric vehicles, semiconductors, and AI. There's been a lot of talk about climate change, and one of the main drivers of climate change is carbon emissions, right? We need to transition to renewable energy, we need to transition to, cleaner fuels, right? And so what that means is that electric vehicles are certainly a part of the future. We're seeing enough of that to be able to say, yes, they're going to be a big part of the future. And when you think about electric vehicles, right, there's two key materials that go into the batteries of those vehicles, right? It's nickel and it's lithium, right? And that has implications on the entire value chain in terms of processing and mining. So you are in the oil and gas servicing business, right? Intellectual curiosity means you have a research analyst that is just focused on what is happening in those things, how it affects me. You can keep doing your oil and gas, but you have to be curious enough about how these things, because you are seeing nations now that are explicitly protecting their advantage. Chile is one of the largest sources of lithium, and they recently nationalized their industry. Indonesia has banned the export of raw nickel, right? So you have to be curious enough about it because there's a chance it's going to be part of the future. Semiconductors, the reason why they're important is that they're the foundation of modern electronics, right? All of the devices that we're all holding have semiconductors in them, right? And nations, again, are now classifying these as strategic sectors. China already has a dominance. The US has aggressively passed policies, about $400 billion, that include subsidies protecting this industry. I mean, the World Trade Organization is up in arms, and the US is like, you guys can sit down and do whatever you're doing, right? So again, this is going to be part of the future, right? And finally, there's AI, right? It's not a question, right? It's going to be part of the future. Intellectual curiosity means that you should be interacting with an AI model, right? And finding out how well it does your job. Just sit there. If you haven't done so, you should, right? Sit down and say, the last reports that you have to write, ask the AI model to write it for you. The last Excel that you had to analyze, put it into an AI model and ask it to analyze for you. If you are in marketing, the last marketing campaign that you just ask the AI model to put it into for you, right? Because you need to be curious enough about how well this AI models do your job, right? Because then you start to get a glimpse of the future and start to innovate around that, right? I mean, I run a technology company. We had an all-hands meeting, and so, I asked questions that how many of you are using an AI model, right, in your jobs, right? And everybody had their hands up, right? So we started asking questions. Okay, tell me how you're using it. Tell me how you're using it. And it was interesting because a lot of the software engineers, right, it's like, hey, they gave me this code to write. I didn't know how to write it, so I just put it inside the AI model. Well, I was writing this code and there was a bug and I didn't know how to, so I just put it inside the AI model. It was very clear that these software engineers had shaved off at least an hour of their time. In fact, one of them, his cheeks were very big because he has time on his hands, right? Now, intellectual curiosity for me means I need to fill up that gap, right? I mean, I asked another one a question, something. It was like, Yvonne, thanks for the question. This is what the AI model said. Is AI paying your salary? So he just typed it in and gave me. But again, you have to be curious enough about it, right? Because it is part of the future, right? So that's what intellectual curiosity means, right? And so in predicting the future, again, you have to be curious enough about it, right? What are the trends that are gaining momentum, right? What are you reading, right? Which raw materials are you supplying to improve the quality of your questions? And then thirdly, we're looking at the opportunities, right? Now that we've clarified what our role is, we see how change is happening, complexity is happening. We have a framework in terms of being able to predict the future enough, right? And now it's looking at the actual innovation. Where are the opportunities, right? And it's all context specific. We're all in different industries, we're in different functions. If you're an entrepreneur, you're in different functions and whatnot, right? So there's a lot of different frameworks to look at that. But as an entrepreneur, you have to have a decent image of the future and which opportunities are you focused on, right? As a visionary, you structured your life to be able to spot those opportunities early. But as you consider opportunities, right, there's three things to consider, right, when you kind of analyze opportunities and maybe you're ranking them in some sort of order. One is the advantage we still have in this market because of the huge development need in our market. Chuka just talked about it. There is no shortage of problems, right? And so that should never be a blocker. Our citizens still need a lot more peace and prosperity in their futures. And as entrepreneurs, how do we create that, right? So there's no shortage of opportunities, right? Number two, deglobalization is creeping in, right, for different reasons. When supply chains were broken during COVID, people started to look inwards, right? But global supply chains will still exist, right, and so things are constantly still moving around. And so one of the things when you're analyzing and thinking about the opportunities and innovation is to say, look, can I find a big reason for a company to come here, right, to be able to localize their supply chain? There's an interesting story of the woman that helped Apple to domesticate their phone screens in China, Chinese entrepreneur. She started her career actually as a factory worker and went on to build successful businesses. But her major success came because she was able to supply the glass, when phones started changing from plastic to glass, the glass touchscreens for Apple, she was able to help them do that. And that was kind of a major win for her, right? So yes, if you think about opportunities, global supply chain, things are still moving around. Can you find a reason for somebody to come and domesticate? And the third thing is that we still have a huge advantage with our demographic, right? Sometime this year, if it hasn't already happened, India would overtake China as the most populous country in the world. And that's major, right? India has held that title since 1950, I think, right? But that's not the big deal. The big deal is the demographic advantage India has over China. It's a younger population, higher fertility rates, lower infant mortality. And so you put this together, and then you see that they have a lot more upside in terms of economic development. In fact, there's another interesting statistic where the proportion of women in business or in the working population in India is lower than China. So huge upside. But then when you look at these things, it feels familiar, right? Because in Nigeria, we still have those same advantages, bringing it home here. So when you think about opportunities, you can't forget that advantage that we have, right? And specifically improving the quality of that capital. And I say this with full knowledge of the Jackman movement, which is still going to persist, right? Just because other countries, don't have this demographic advantage that we have, and quite frankly, they just have to pull from markets like ours. That's the only way that they can survive, right? But even with that happening, right, I'm very convinced that, when you consider opportunities, it's a safe bet to say, we have this demographic advantage. How do I exploit that in the opportunities that I'm considering, right? Nigeria just becomes more attractive to capital just because our talent is, maybe 10% better or 15% better, right? You can hire people to do basic tasks without a lot of reskilling, right? It's also important to consider the risks, right? We're entrepreneurs. We embrace the ambiguity. We're comfortable with these risks, right? And like I said, the pace of complexity and change is scary. 5 years ago, you could have, or 10 years ago, you could have invested heavily in training maybe an army of cheaper software engineers to serve a global market, right? Chuka talked a lot about those companies. I invested in a few of them, right? And all of a sudden we wake up and AI has advanced so fast that, it almost feels like it could start to commoditize that skill, right? And so what that means is that, yes, we still have a huge advantage in our markets in Nigeria and Africa, right? But as an entrepreneur, you have to be executing quicker, and technology also has to be a part of that. So let's wrap this up and try to, put this all together, right? We're talking about innovating for the future. We're sitting down here as entrepreneurs, right? And my argument is that intellectual curiosity is a big framework for being able to innovate for that future that you see. The operating environment in Nigeria, it's tough on a normal day. And one of the things that I think about is, the current geopolitical challenges means that we face the risk that history happens to us, without, a lot of control over that. And so the stakes are much higher as an entrepreneur in Nigeria and Africa, even more so. Your success is much more than just you, right? And Nigeria, like I said, we need some big successes. We need a lot more large-scale enterprises. We need to show the world that we can do bigger things, right? But entrepreneurs, we're the set of people that are built to do so. Your determination, your adaptability is needed now more than ever. The ability to just keep going, change course when things don't always work out. Embracing failure because it's not the end, right? And your ability to create value is a function of painting an accurate picture of the future and exploiting the opportunities that you spot. And intellectual curiosity is a proven lever to spot those gaps earlier than others. So stay curious. Let's keep this amebo going. Thank you.
Also the convener of the platform.